3 years ago, I was living in Fresno, California, and working a job that drained the life out of me. It wasn't that the work was difficult, but it was soul-sucking. Every day felt the same. Wake up, go to the office, work through endless emails, attend pointless meetings, come home exhausted, eat something quick, and crash into bed only to wake up and do it all over again. It felt like I was trapped in a cycle that didn't lead anywhere. I dreamed of doing something meaningful, something creative like writing a novel. But between work, errands, and just trying to get through each day, I never had the energy or time to pursue my dream. Writing always seemed like something I'd do someday, but that day never came. One winter, after months of feeling like I was wasting my life, I decided to make a change. I was so tired of the monotony that I realized I needed a break, a real one. I took a week off work and made a bold decision. I would spend the time in a remote cabin, far from the city, to finally focus on my writing. No distractions, no obligations, just me, nature, and a lot of solitude. It felt like the perfect opportunity to break free from my routine and immerse myself in the creative process. The idea of writing my novel was still a dream, but maybe this time I'd give it a shot. I began searching online for a cabin to rent, something secluded, peaceful, and inspiring. After some digging, I came across a listing for a small cabin located about 30 miles outside of Groveland near Yosemite National Park. The pictures were exactly what I'd envisioned, a cozy little place surrounded by towering trees and snow-covered grounds with no other houses in sight. The host's description promised the cabin was perfect for creatives seeking inspiration. The peace and quiet sounded like exactly what I needed. While the idea of being completely alone in the woods made me nervous, I tried to push those thoughts aside. After all, people do this all the time, right? I booked the cabin immediately, looking forward to the fresh start it promised. The journey to the cabin wasn't short. It was about a 3-hour drive from Fresno, and by the time I hit the final stretch, the road narrowed into a winding trail that seemed to stretch on forever. The landscape around me was beautiful, with snow blanketing the ground and trees towering on either side of the road. But the isolation started to set in, and the further I drove, the more I began to feel how truly alone I was. I started wondering if this was such a good idea after all. Still, I pressed on, determined to make the most of this opportunity. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting an eerie twilight glow on everything. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon and the light was quickly fading. When I arrived, I was immediately struck by how perfectly it matched the pictures. The cabin was small but cozy, with large windows that offered an uninterrupted view of the surrounding forest. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, nestled in a grove of trees and dusted with snow. Inside, the cabin was simple but charming, just what I had hoped for. A tiny kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a small bedroom with a twin-sized bed. There were no luxuries, but the place was comfortable. The host had thoughtfully left a binder with instructions on how to use the generator since there was no electricity, and provided emergency contact information in case anything went wrong. The Wi-Fi was spotty and there was no cell service, but that was part of the appeal. I was here to disconnect after all. The first 2 days went by without a hitch. I woke up early each morning, brewed a cup of coffee, and settled in front of the wood-burning stove to write. In the afternoons, I walked through the woods, letting the crisp winter air clear my mind. In the evenings, I curled up by the fire with a book, feeling like I had finally found the peace I'd been craving. The silence was almost unnerving at first. So quiet, it seemed unnatural, but I gradually got used to it. I even began to enjoy the solitude, the feeling of being completely removed from the world. It was everything I had hoped for, a much-needed retreat from the chaos of daily life. But on the third night, something changed. I had been working on a new chapter for hours, my laptop open in front of me as I tried to write. It was around 8:20 p.m., and the room was dimly lit by the flickering firelight. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought I had imagined it. It was so unexpected. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of winter? But then it came again, louder this time. I froze, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just someone lost, or a neighbor stopping by for some reason, though that seemed unlikely. Still, I got up cautiously, walking to the door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch, wearing a dark jacket and a beanie. He looked a little out of place, but I couldn't tell much else. I hesitated before calling out, "Hello, who's there?" His voice came back calm and polite. "Hi, sorry to bother you, but I'm lost. My car broke down a little ways up the road, and I can't get a signal. Can I use your phone to call for help?" Something about the way he spoke, too casual and almost rehearsed, immediately set off warning bells in my mind. The whole situation felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I had to be cautious. "I don't have a phone," I lied, trying to sound firm. "There's no service out here." There was a long pause on the other side of the door, and then he spoke again. "Do you have Wi-Fi? I could use that to call someone." I shook my head even though I knew there was no Wi-Fi either. "Sorry, I can't help you," I said, trying to stay calm. Another pause, then a louder knock, this time more insistent. "Please, it's freezing out here. Just let me in for a minute." That's when the fear hit me. His tone had changed from polite to something else, something more desperate. It was as if he wasn't asking anymore, but demanding. I backed away from the door and grabbed the first thing I could find, a fire poker from beside the stove. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. "I'm calling the cops," I yelled, though I knew it wouldn't do much good out here. No service, no signal. I heard him move around to the side of the cabin and I ran to the window, my heart pounding. There he was, standing there staring in. When our eyes met, he smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something that made my stomach drop. I quickly pulled the curtain shut, feeling a wave of panic take over. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to leave? But the snow was deep and my car was parked far away. What if he was waiting outside, ready to follow me? For the next hour, I stayed locked inside the bathroom, listening to him bang on the windows, try the doors, and whisper things I couldn't understand. His movements were slow, deliberate, methodical. It was enough to paralyze me with fear. 2 winters ago, during my final college winter break, I was physically and mentally drained. I had just turned 21 and spent weeks preparing for exams, surviving on instant noodles and caffeine. My days had blurred into nights, filled with endless assignments and sleepless study sessions. By the time finals ended, my mind felt like it was on the verge of snapping. I needed an escape, something that wasn't just lounging around or scrolling through my phone. I wanted a reset, a chance to reconnect with myself and find peace away from the chaos. Nature had always been my go-to remedy, so I began searching for remote places to visit. That's when I stumbled upon a hidden gem, a secluded hot spring tucked away in the forests of Northern California. It seemed perfect. The photos showed serene pools surrounded by tall trees, and the description promised tranquility. It was a day trip, far from city noise, and exactly what I needed. My parents, however, weren't thrilled. My mom kept saying, "You never know who's out there." Her worry was palpable, but I reassured her. I wasn't planning to camp or stay overnight, just a quick visit to clear my head. I promised to check in when I got back. The drive to the hot springs was long but incredibly peaceful. As I left the city behind, the highways grew quieter. The hum of traffic faded, replaced by the occasional bird call and the sound of my tires on the road. The landscape transformed as I entered the forest. Towering pine trees lined the narrow, winding road, their branches forming a canopy above. The deeper I drove, the more isolated I felt. Yet it wasn't an unpleasant isolation, it was liberating. The stresses of school and daily life seemed to dissolve with every mile. By the time I reached the parking lot, it was just after noon. The lot was small, with space for maybe 10 cars. Only 2 cars were parked there, which reassured me. It meant I wouldn't be entirely alone, but the place wouldn't be crowded either. A perfect balance. I grabbed my backpack from the car, packed lightly with just a towel, water bottle, snacks, and my phone. I clipped my car keys securely to the bag and, feeling confident, decided to leave my wallet in the car. I figured I wouldn't need it. The hot springs were everything I'd hoped for. Steam rose from the natural pools, curling into the crisp winter air. The earthy scent of damp soil in the surrounding forest filled my lungs, making me feel calm instantly. Benches were scattered around the area, and I found a quiet spot near the largest pool. I slipped off my shoes, tucked my backpack under the bench to keep it out of sight, and dipped my toes into the water. The warmth was heavenly. Sliding in, I felt my muscles relax, the tension melting away. The contrast between the steaming water and the cold winter air made the experience even more soothing. For the first time in weeks, my mind was quiet. I leaned back, gazing up at the canopy of trees above me, completely at peace. As I soaked, I noticed an odd sensation creeping into my mind, a subtle unease. Twice, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me. Turning to look, I saw nothing. The sound could have been anything, a branch snapping, an animal rustling nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be there. I shrugged it off. The other cars in the lot meant there were likely other visitors, though I hadn't seen anyone since arriving. I assumed it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After about an hour, my skin began to prune and the air grew colder. Reluctantly, I decided it was time to get out. Reaching under the bench for my backpack, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't there. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe I'd placed it on another bench. I quickly scanned the area, checking the nearby benches and corners around the pools. Still, nothing. Panic set in. My phone and car keys were in that bag. Without them, I was stranded. I called out into the stillness. "Hey, did anyone take a black backpack?" My voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. The place felt unnervingly quiet. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived, and the other 2 cars in the parking lot were my only clue that there had been others here at all. I decided to head back to the parking lot. Maybe someone had mistakenly taken my bag and left it there. As I walked, I became hyper-aware of the silence. The usual sounds of a forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were absent. It was just me and the crunch of gravel underfoot. When I reached the lot, my stomach dropped. The other 2 cars were gone. Mine was the only vehicle left. Then I noticed something. Wet footprints on the ground, leading from the parking lot into the woods. They weren't mine. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the footprints. They were fresh, and in my desperation to retrieve my belongings, I clung to the hope that this was all a misunderstanding. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from the hot springs. The trees grew thicker, and the fading light made it harder to see. I shivered, clutching my towel around me for warmth. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I spotted something ahead, my backpack. It was sitting upright against a tree as if someone had carefully placed it there. Relief flooded me and I hurried toward it, but just as I reached out, I froze. A man stepped out from behind the tree. He was holding my backpack in one hand and a knife in the other. His appearance was chilling, pale skin, hollow cheeks, dark circles under his eyes, and filthy, tattered clothes. His hair was matted and his expression was eerily blank. He didn't say a word, just stared at me. My body locked up, I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then he took a step toward me. The moment he moved, something inside me snapped. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going. Branches scratched at my arms and legs as I tore through the forest. The cold air burned my lungs, and my heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't dare stop. I didn't look back. After what felt like hours, I stumbled back into the hot springs area. My body trembled with exhaustion, but the man was nowhere in sight. The parking lot was still empty and my car keys were gone. Terrified and stranded, I hid in one of the changing rooms, locking the door and curling up in a corner. I stayed there all night, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, I ventured out and found a park ranger in the lot. I ran to him breathless and panicked, recounting everything. He called the sheriff, but their search turned up nothing. No man, no backpack, nothing. What was meant to be a peaceful escape had turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It was the winter of our college break, and after weeks of cramming for exams and facing the usual stress of schoolwork, my friends and I were desperate for a getaway. We needed something relaxing and nature-filled, far away from the pressures of campus life. After much debate and excitement, we settled on the San Bernardino Mountains. We picked the Cougar Crest Trail because it wasn't a super strenuous hike but still promised some stunning views. Plus, we'd heard the trail was magical in winter, with the snow covering everything, creating a peaceful, almost surreal landscape. For the trip, we rented a cozy cabin in Big Bear Lake, just a short 15-minute drive from the trailhead. The group consisted of 6 of us. Me, my best friend Katie, her boyfriend Ryan, my boyfriend Alex, and 2 other friends, Mia and Jordan. We'd been planning this for weeks, buying gear, snacks and drinks, and making playlists for the long drive. Everyone was in high spirits and the excitement was palpable. Katie and Mia were especially looking forward to the trip because they were obsessed with getting Instagram-worthy pictures of the snow-covered trees and snow-capped peaks. The morning of the hike arrived, and we were all buzzing with anticipation. The air was crisp and cold as we layered up in our warmest clothes. We packed up plenty of water, snacks, and a camera. It was freezing, but the kind of cold that felt invigorating when you were moving. The drive to the trailhead was beautiful, with the snow-covered scenery setting the perfect winter vibe. The trail itself was quiet when we arrived. There were a few other hikers here and there, but for the most part we had the trail to ourselves, just us and the mountains. The first hour of the hike was perfect. We stopped often to take pictures of the frosted trees, the pristine snow, and the gorgeous mountain views. The fresh snow gave everything an almost magical glow, and the group was filled with joy and laughter. Everyone was having a great time, joking around, pointing out wildlife, and chatting as we walked. After an hour of hiking, we reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a breathtaking view of the valley below. It was the perfect spot to capture the beauty of the landscape. Katie immediately suggested we get a group photo, and everyone enthusiastically agreed. We gathered together, laughing and adjusting our positions while Alex set up the camera timer. Once the picture was taken, I noticed a small narrow path leading off the main trail. It wasn't an official trail, just a break in the trees that seemed to lead to a promising vantage point. I told the group I'd be back in a minute and wandered off alone to get a few photos. It felt peaceful, and I thought it would be nice to get some quiet moments to myself. As soon as I stepped off the main trail, something about the air felt different. It wasn't just quieter, everything felt still. The usual sounds of the forest, the gentle rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the crunch of snow underfoot were all muted. The silence was so deep it almost felt unnatural. I told myself it was just the isolation of being alone and brushed it off. I continued walking deeper into the woods, searching for a good spot to take photos. I finally found a spot where the trees parted just enough to give a clear view of the surrounding snowy landscape. As I set up my camera to snap a shot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I tried to ignore it. I took a few photos, but then suddenly I heard a crunch behind me, like the sound of boots pressing into snow. I froze. My heart raced as I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see one of my friends coming to join me, but there was no one there. I quickly turned back to the camera, trying to brush off the growing unease. But then the sound came again, louder this time and much closer. It wasn't a distant crunch like before, it was right behind me. I spun around quickly, scanning the area, but still there was nothing. The trees were silent, no birds, no wind. The forest felt as if it was holding its breath, waiting. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. It was almost as if something or someone was watching me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just an animal, but the stillness made my instincts scream, "Guys." I called out, trying to sound casual, but my voice was shaky, betraying my fear. No response came. My pulse quickened, and I felt the sudden need to get back to my friends. I started walking briskly, but the moment I stopped, the sound stopped too. It was like something was following my movements, mirroring them. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Panic began to creep in. I picked up my pace, nearly running back to the main trail, but when I reached the spot where I had last seen my friends, they were nowhere to be found. I yelled their names, my voice echoing through the trees, but no one responded. The path ahead of me was empty, and that's when I saw him. A man stood a little further down the trail, partially hidden by the trees. He was wearing a long, dirty coat and a hood that covered most of his face. He wasn't moving at first, he was just standing there watching me. I froze, my stomach dropped, and my mind raced. He wasn't one of my friends, and I didn't recognize him at all. Panic flooded my chest. I quickly thought about running, but the snow made it impossible to move quickly. My feet felt heavy, and my boots kept slipping. I reached for my phone, but my hands were too numb to take it out of my pocket. My voice shook as I called out, "Hey." I tried to sound confident, but the words came out more nervous than I wanted. "I'm not alone. My friends are right up ahead." He didn't respond. He just kept walking toward me, slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on me the entire time. I turned quickly and started running down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. "Help, help!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, desperate for someone to hear me. My boots slipped on the icy path, but I didn't dare slow down. Every breath burned in my lungs from the cold air, and my mind raced with terror. I kept running, eyes scanning the trail ahead for my friends. Suddenly, I felt it. A hand shot out and grabbed my arm. I screamed in terror as I was yanked back, struggling to break free. The man's grip was like iron, unyielding. He started dragging me toward the trees, and I kicked and twisted, trying to escape. "Someone help me!" I screamed again, but the sound of my voice felt small in the vastness of the mountains. Just as I thought I couldn't break free, I saw them. My friends were running back up the trail toward me. Katie was screaming my name, and Ryan and Alex were yelling at the man to let me go. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by dread as the man hesitated for a moment. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted into the woods. My legs buckled, and I collapsed into Alex's arms, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. Katie was sobbing, holding me tightly. Ryan and Jordan ran after the man for a short distance, but came back empty-handed. They couldn't find him. We didn't waste a second. We rushed to the nearest ranger station to report what had happened. The rangers listened, but didn't seem hopeful about finding the man. They promised they would patrol the area, but the encounter had shaken us all. That hike changed everything for me. What was supposed to be a peaceful and fun escape turned into a nightmare. I realized how vulnerable you can be in the wilderness, especially when you least expect it. I've never looked at nature quite the same way again. If you're listening to this, please be careful out there. You never know who or what might be waiting. Our family had been looking forward to this trip for months. The cabin near Donner Lake was everything we'd imagined, rustic yet comfortable, nestled among tall pines dusted with fresh snow. The location, just outside Truckee, California, was perfect. A short drive from charming shops and restaurants, but secluded enough to feel like a true escape. My parents were eager for a chance to relax, my younger sister was excited about sledding, and I had my own plans for adventure. For the first evening, everything went as expected. We played board games by the fire, sipped hot chocolate, and marveled at the snowfall outside the window. It felt like a scene from a postcard. But as much as I loved the idea of family time, I'm not one to stay cooped up for long. When I noticed the snowy trails just outside the cabin, I decided the next morning would be my chance to explore. I woke before dawn, the cabin still dark and silent. The only sound was the low hum of the heater, a comforting backdrop to the quiet stillness. I dressed quickly, layering against the freezing temperatures outside. My running shoes felt firm against my feet, and I was excited to feel the crisp morning air on my face. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me immediately. The chill stung my cheeks and my breath formed little clouds in the air, but the scene was magical. Snow blanketed the ground, glistening faintly under the dim light of the early morning. I set out on the trail I'd seen the day before, eager to see where it would lead. The forest was serene, the only sound coming from the crunch of my footsteps on the snow. I felt like I was in my own world, the towering trees and untouched landscape wrapping me in their solitude. About 10 minutes into the jog, I noticed something strange. Footprints ahead of me on the trail. They weren't mine, they were too far away. The prints looked like sneakers, not boots, so I assumed someone else had gone jogging earlier. That seemed reasonable, even though I hadn't seen anyone in the area. Still, the sight was a little jarring. I'd been so sure I was the only one out here at first, I kept running without much thought. But as I followed the trail of footprints, I started to notice something unusual. The steps weren't even. They didn't follow a natural jogging rhythm. Instead, they seemed irregular, like whoever made them had been running in short bursts or staggering. I slowed my pace, my eyes scanning the dense trees on either side of the trail. They stood like sentinels, their snow-laden branches casting long shadows. Everything seemed perfectly still, but an inexplicable unease settled over me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, though I couldn't say why. The trail curved sharply, and as I rounded the bend, my stomach dropped. Another set of footprints had appeared in the snow, these ones larger and heavier boot prints. And they weren't heading away from me. They were following the same direction I was. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming out in visible puffs. My heart started to pound, an icy weight settling in my chest. I looked around, searching the woods for any sign of movement, but the trees remained silent and still. Forcing myself to stay calm, I reasoned it could just be hikers. Maybe they'd been walking together before splitting off, but something about the situation didn't feel right. I decided to keep moving, though I slowed down significantly. Each crunch of snow underfoot seemed amplified in the heavy silence. Occasionally I thought I heard something, a faint snapping of a branch or the muffled sound of snow crunching behind me. I told myself it was just wildlife. Tahoe was full of animals after all, and there was no reason to think otherwise. When I reached a clearing, the tension in my chest eased slightly. The trees parted, revealing a stunning view of Donner Lake. The rising sun reflected off its frozen surface, painting the scene in hues of gold and silver. For a moment, I forgot about the footprints and the strange unease. But the footprints in the snow told a different story. The first set veered off into the woods on my left, disappearing into the denser trees. Relieved, I assumed the person had left the trail. Feeling reassured, I started jogging again. My breath evened out and I focused on the rhythm of my steps. Then I noticed them. New footprints, fresh, crisp, and overlapping mine. These weren't in front of me like before, they were behind me. My stomach twisted as I stopped and turned around. The trail stretched behind me, empty except for the trees. The only visible marks in the snow were mine and the ones that had been following me. Panic surged. Someone was out there. Someone had been following me. I debated what to do. Turning back might mean running into whoever was behind me. Going forward was my best chance. The trail would eventually loop back to the cabin. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding harder with every step. My ears strained for sounds, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making me jump. The trail narrowed, the trees pressing in on either side like a tunnel. Then I heard it. A deliberate, heavy crunch of snow, closer than before. I whipped around, my chest tightening. For a moment, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a figure darting behind a tree. I ran. The fear in my chest turned to pure adrenaline as I pushed myself faster than I thought possible. The path twisted and turned, and I focused on putting as much distance as I could between myself and whoever was behind me. But just as I thought I was safe, I saw him. A man stepped out from behind a tree, blocking the trail. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and heavy boots. His face was hidden beneath a hood. Before I could react, he lunged. His hand grabbed my arm and I screamed, thrashing wildly. I kicked, twisted, and clawed at him. My nails scraped his cheek and he cursed, releasing me just long enough for me to tear away. I didn't stop running until the cabin came into view. My legs felt like lead and my lungs burned, but I forced myself to keep going. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My family, startled by my entrance, rushed over. I couldn't even speak. I just closed the curtains and leaned against the door, shaking. When the police came, they searched the trail but found no sign of the man. They told me it was likely a transient or someone trying to scare me, but the reassurances did little to ease my fear. The next morning, we packed up and left. Months later, the memory of that morning still haunts me. The footprints, the shadow in the woods, the man's face hidden beneath the hood. It's something I can't forget, no matter how much I try. Last winter, I found myself completely drained. Work had been a relentless grind, and my social life felt non-existent. I desperately needed a change, time to myself, away from the monotony of everyday life. I'd saved up some vacation time and decided to use it. Snowboarding has always been a passion of mine ever since high school. I'm not an expert or anything, but there's something about gliding down the slopes that clears my mind like nothing else. I started looking into destinations. Big resorts like Tahoe caught my eye initially, but the costs were overwhelming. On top of that, I dreaded the idea of huge crowds and long lines. I wanted peace and solitude. That's when I stumbled upon a smaller resort near Bear Valley, California. It wasn't fancy, but the reviews were promising. Great trails, affordable prices, and fewer visitors. It sounded like the perfect getaway. After booking a budget-friendly motel nearby, I packed my gear and set out late Friday evening. The drive to the resort was beautiful, almost therapeutic. The roads were mostly empty, and the snow-covered trees lining the route sparkled under the moonlight, creating a postcard-like scene. By the time I reached the resort early Saturday morning, the tranquility I'd been craving felt within reach. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a handful of cars scattered around. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. No crowds, no chaos, just open slopes and crisp mountain air. I quickly grabbed my gear, purchased my lift pass, and hopped on the first chairlift. As I ascended, the cold air nipped at my face, but I couldn't stop smiling. The snow looked untouched, and the sky was a brilliant blue. It felt like I had the entire mountain to myself. The morning was everything I wanted. I spent hours exploring the main trails, which were well-groomed and easy to navigate. It felt liberating to carve through the snow without the pressure of crowds. But after a while, my curiosity got the better of me. Near the edge of one run, I noticed a side trail. It wasn't prominently marked, almost as if it was meant to be overlooked. The trail wasn't marked as particularly challenging, but it looked rough, narrow, and surrounded by dense trees. To me, it felt like an invitation, a hidden gem waiting to be discovered. Without a second thought, I veered off the main path and onto the trail. The experience was magical at first. The snow was pristine, completely untouched, and the towering trees around me muffled every sound, creating an otherworldly silence. It felt like I'd stumbled into a private winter wonderland. The narrowness of the trail made it more challenging to navigate, but I loved the thrill of it. About halfway down the hidden trail, the atmosphere shifted. I couldn't shake this strange feeling, a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. It started as a prickling on the back of my neck, that instinctual sensation you get when someone's watching you. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something, or rather, someone. Further up the slope, partially hidden behind some trees, a figure stood completely still. They weren't skiing or snowboarding, they weren't even moving, they were just standing there, watching me. I paused briefly, pretending to adjust my goggles, and glanced back. They were still there, motionless. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just resting, admiring the view. Telling myself it was nothing, I pushed forward, picking up speed as I continued down the trail. By the time I reached the bottom of the trail, I turned around to look back up, but the person was gone. My rational side tried to brush it off. They probably took a different route or were just a fellow snowboarder enjoying the quiet, but deep down, I felt unsettled. The rest of the day, I stuck to the main slopes, staying away from isolated areas. I didn't see that person again, and by the time the lifts closed, my nerves had mostly settled. Exhausted but content, I grabbed a hot chocolate in the lodge and planned to return the next morning for one last run before heading home. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to make the most of my last day. When I arrived at the resort, the parking lot was nearly empty. Less crowded than the day before, the stillness felt both calming and eerie. I warmed up with a few easy runs on the main trails, but something kept tugging at me. That hidden trail from the previous day lingered in my mind. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was the challenge, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. Whatever the reason, I found myself back on the chairlift heading towards it once again. When I reached the hidden trail, it looked untouched, just like the day before. The snow was pristine, and the surrounding trees stood in a heavy silence. I started down the trail, but this time something felt different. The peaceful solitude I'd experienced the day before had been replaced by an undercurrent of dread. Every shadow between the trees felt ominous, and my nerves were on edge. About a third of the way down, my worst fears were confirmed. There he was again, the figure in black. This time, he was closer. Dressed head to toe in black, jacket, pants, helmet, and goggles, he seemed to melt into the shadows. He stood halfway hidden behind a tree, watching me. My heart raced as I forced myself to keep going, pretending not to notice. The figure didn't move, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole way down. I picked up speed, hoping to put as much distance as possible between us. The bottom of the trail was in sight, and for a moment I thought I was safe. Then out of nowhere, something slammed into me from behind. The impact sent me flying, and I hit the ground hard. My snowboard came off, and I slid a few feet before coming to a stop. Before I could even process what happened, he was on me. He grabbed me by the jacket and yanked me up. His face was completely covered. Only his goggles and mask were visible. His breath came in quick, harsh bursts, fogging up the air between us. "Wallet." "Phone," he demanded, his voice sharp and unrelenting. My mind raced as fear paralyzed me. I didn't have much, a cheap wallet and my phone trembling. I handed them over. He snatched them out of my hands and shoved me back into the snow. Without saying another word, he disappeared into the trees as quickly as he'd appeared. I lay there in shock, my body trembling from the adrenaline and cold. It felt like an eternity before I finally gathered the strength to get up. Strapping my board back on, I made my way to the lodge. I reported the incident to the staff, but there wasn't much they could do. That part of the trail didn't have cameras, and the man was long gone. I drove home later that afternoon, replaying the events over and over in my mind. The robbery wasn't what haunted me the most. It was the helplessness, the speed at which everything spiraled out of control. I haven't been able to shake the memory since. I plan to go snowboarding again, but never alone, and definitely not at a remote place like that. That hidden trail, I'm never going back.